everyone, and welcome to Preemie Chats, a place for parents and healthcare professionals to gather, share stories, and learn from each other. I'm your host for today, Jenna Morton. I am preemie mom to 32-week twin boys who are now 10 years old. Preemie Chats is the creation of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, also known as CPBF. The foundation is a parent-led charity that helps families during and after their NICU time through education, support, and advocacy. You can take some time to visit our website. You can see it there on the screen, canadianpreemies.org. You will find a whole host of resources. All of our previous Preemie Chats are there as videos, and this one will be uploaded as well after our discussion today. So if you know someone who wants to, who should watch this, or that you would like to share it with them, you'll be able to do that. Most importantly, what you'll find on the website is a community of parents and professionals who are working together to help our children thrive. And this is very much an inclusive environment, and we'd love to know where you're joining us from today, whether you're a healthcare provider or a parent. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what brings you with us today. And as we go through, please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments as well. Today's discussion is very much about everyone participating together. Our discussion is going to focus on new recommendations that are aimed at protecting the presence of parents in the NICU during and after a pandemic. As we know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, neonatal care units across Canada and across the world had various measures that restricted parents' movement within the unit. This impacted family-centered care, parent access to various education and support services, and the overall physical and emotional needs of both parents and infants. A group of healthcare providers, researchers, hospital administrators, and parents have worked together to create a set of practice recommendations that takes into consideration the importance of parental presence in the NICU. And today we're going to hear from the co-leads of this, the NICU Parental Presence Study Project. They're going to offer some insight on the process, the recommendations themselves, and next steps to adopting these as national guidelines. Our first co-lead that is joining us today is a face that many of you will know. Fabiana Bikini is the Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. Hello.
Hi, Jenna.
And joining Fabiana for today's presentation is Dr. Marsha Campbell-Yeo, who is a professor at the Dalhousie University School of Nursing, working in pediatrics, psychology, and neuroscience. And Marsha is well known for her research and leadership in this realm. Welcome to you both.
Great. Thanks, Jenna. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much. I know that a lot of work has gone into this project. I was behind the scenes on some of it, and I think people are going to be really interested in both the process and the recommendations that came out of it. And I know that you both have a presentation prepared for us that's in depth, that's going to go through it. So I think we'll just move into starting with that and come back at the end for some questions.
Wow, Jenna, thank you so much for having me as a guest today. I am truly honored to be presenting here with Dr. Marsha Campbell-Yeo. The study we are about to share holds immense meaning for us and the families supported by the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. Our sincere hope is that the recommendations we present today will not just be considered, but embraced and eventually implemented in ICUs across Canada. So before we dive into the study, let me express the profound significance of inclusive collaboration. For the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, this project marked a milestone. It was the first time a parent co-led a research initiative, and for that, we extend our deepest gratitude to Marsha for her commitment to true partnership and collaboration with parents in research. As you can see from our screen, we had a multidisciplinary team from across Canada, including many parents, and Jenna, who she mentioned that she was involved in this project as well. And we also want to acknowledge the Canadian Institute for Health Research, CIHR, for funding this project. So we all know the benefits for parental presence in the NICU, and we all know that evidence is indisputable. Parental presence not only supports the development and growth of babies' brains, but also leads to improved breastfeeding rates, reduced infections, less readmissions, better self-regulation at 18 months of age, decreased stress response, and shorter hospital stays. Now, as we move forward, it is crucial to recognize the positive impact goes beyond our babies. Parents benefit profoundly from being present in NICUs. Studies consistently show reductions in parental stress, anxiety, and depression, with remarkable improvements in parent and infant interactions. But we also know that this evidence already existed, but March 2020 brought unprecedented challenges as the COVID-19 pandemic emerged. Hospitals had to make really hard decisions, leading to a variety of restrictions on parental presence in NICUs. Some had visiting hours, while others did not allow parental rotation. And in most cases, only one parent at a time could be in the unit. So it is important for us to acknowledge that restrictions did cause harm. There was extensive research conducted around the world to demonstrate the negative impact. For example, one study highlighted significant increase in anxiety and depression among mothers. And Marsha has also made important contributions through her research on this topic, including the use of technology in NICUs. There is vast literature that we'll be happy to share with you. So Marsha continued to with a national survey involving parents and healthcare providers. The findings revealed significant disparities in parental presence policies among Canadian NICUs. And more importantly, there was a clear correlation between increased parental stress and more severe restrictions. Let me move forward here. So let's focus now on the present study. So this study was initiated because of clear disparity in parental presence policies, even among NICUs located just across the street from one another. It is a concerning fact that there are no national recommendations to ensure equity across Canada concerning parental presence in NICUs. And this issue becomes even more crucial as we prepare for potential future outbreaks. And Canada needs consistent policies regarding parental presence. So the primary goal of the study is to address these inequities in care across Canada. Our diverse team came together to create national consensus recommendations informing parental presence and support in the NICU. These recommendations incorporated the best available practice, values and preferences, and priority, not only for our current circumstances, but also in preparation for a post-COVID-19 recovery and future pandemic management. So now I will pass to Marsha, who will talk us through the process behind the recommendations and give the details of our findings. Marsha.
Oh, thank you, Fabiana, and thanks for everyone for joining today. Of course, this topic is so near and dear to my heart. So what did we do to address such a really complex problem about trying to find consensus across the entire country? Well, as Fabiana had mentioned earlier, previous to this study, as well as part of this study, we circulated 3 national surveys to parents, healthcare providers, and leaders to look at and ask what they felt were the biggest issues that occurred with respect to restricting parent and family presence in neonatal intensive care units. We also collected data on the impact of those restrictions on infant health outcomes. So collectively, we took all of the data from those surveys and we overlaid it with the existing evidence. And from that, we pieced together 50 items that had been brought forward either through survey or existing literature on items that would be particularly important with respect to parental presence in neonatal intensive care units. And with that, then we created this survey and we used a process or a Delphi process in order to pare this down, because of course we couldn't make 50 recommendations. We needed to make it concise so that it was manageable and feasible for neonatal intensive care units to actually implement. Fabiana, if you could take the next slide. So why did we use a Delphi approach? Well, one, it was really a way to have large and diverse cross-sectorial representation to help us to identify those items with the highest importance. The surveys were disseminated across our co-applicants, clinical and national networks, until we could find a clearly representative group. And so this was considered to be both parents, caregivers, healthcare providers, and executive leaders. And so we really had, we were very grateful to, of course, the Canadian Premature Baby Foundation, Canadian Neonatal Network, Children's Healthcare Canada, and multiple societies such as Canadian Association for Neonatal Nurses, Canadian Pediatric Society, etc., to help us find representative groups. You can go next slide, please. And so with the Delphi method, really we had equal representation from parents and healthcare providers. And just as a reminder, our goal for the round one was to reduce items, the 50 items, to the 20 most important. And so we really asked participants to simply rate from very low importance to very high importance each of the items. So for example, here is an example where it says access for parents to participate and usual care tasks for their infant, and participants ranked each of these items, the 50 items. Next slide. And so some examples of when we then brought the 50 down to 20, some examples of items of most importance felt to be that should be included in the consensus discussion were things like access for parents to participate in usual care, access for parents to provide skin-to-skin contact as often as they want, and access to mothers to breastfeed or access lactation support or breast pumps. Next slide. Some examples that were still ranked in the top 20, but perhaps items of slightly lesser importance for inclusion in the consensus discussion were things around specificity of the exact infectious status of the parent or caregiver, access to some therapy services, and parental access to current policies and explanation and sort of ongoing updates. Next slide. And so once we were able to pare it down for the top 50 to the top 20, then we circulated again in a round two with equal amounts of parents and healthcare providers responding, and asked them to rank each item in order of importance to include in discussion for national recommendations for ongoing and pandemic management, as well as post-pandemic policies. People were then just asked simply to rank order each item from one highest relative importance to the low to down to 20, the lowest relative importance. Next slide. So once we had that down to 10 items, getting the feedback from everyone, of course, we had to come up with a consensus team or group. And again, we really wanted it to be representative and cross-sectorial across the country, but also across families, clinicians, and other community partners and leaders. So we had representation, as we said, families, clinicians such as nurses, neonatologists, pediatricians, infectious disease and public health, of course, we wanted to include, and advocacy and leadership roles, representation and leads from our national networks and clinical societies, as well as experts from health policy research. And so then it really came to trying to find what framework would we use to help frame our decisions around our recommendations. So we elected to do a values and preference framework. This is a framework that is emerging, particularly in the neonatal world and other pediatric settings, in which it takes into account the values of the participants, their perspectives, their beliefs, expectation, and goals for health, as well as preferences in which participants are provided information from the literature on potential benefits, harms, costs, and inconvenience or feasibility of the recommendations, and then they're able to provide their preference on how to create their consensus decisions. So, of course, for each of the elements, each element took a very in-depth literature review of the evidence. This is such a busy slide. It will be posted, but the next few slides, not going to spend a lot of time on, other than to let you know that for each of the recommendations, the participants in the consensus group were provided outcomes of interest with respect to infant and parent improved health and well-being, what the level of evidence was, what the degree of benefit was, and the certainty of that evidence. Similarly, they were then provided with a very similar table for each of the recommendations around potential harms that were related to the specificity of the recommendation. Next slide. And so again, very similar slide, but of course it was such a tremendous amount of information that then prior to voting, the participants received a sort of a summary of all the outcomes. So in this slide, you can see the benefits were at the top, the interpretation, the certainty of evidence, and harms on the bottom, and the certainty of evidence related to those, and whether it was low, moderate, or high. Taking all this information, then participants were able to vote on whether or not the recommendation should be passed in its current state, or whether there needed to be changes in the wording, and or whether or not it would not be passed. So next slide, Fabiana. So for example, we have strong recommendations in favor of each of the items, and we also will have conditional, which I'll tell you in a moment. So when we come up with a strong recommendation, what it was is that given the strength of the known benefits, that they significantly outweighed any potential harm, it was able to say that we strongly recommend this in that it's unlikely, based on new evidence, that could potentially change our recommendation, and that this should be applied in current and future pandemic planning. So for examples of our strong recommendations, Fabiana, next slide. So first and foremost, there was that parent and caregivers should be considered essential caregivers for their infants in the NICU. And this would mean that institutions uptaking this recommendation would change any of their policies that use the word visitation or included parents or caregivers in the same way that they would include perhaps other people family members who would be still considered under visitor status. Next slide. And so we defined parent or caregiver or birthing person as either biological mothers or fathers, non-biological mothers or fathers. We wanted to be inclusive of all sex and gender, parent coupling, i.e. same-sex parents, non-binary parents, adoptive parents, or primary guardians. Next slide. And we then had the method in which we voted to ensure that we reduced any sort of stress or sort of feelings that anyone was under any seeing other people's votes, or because there was a very wide, diverse group, we did it all anonymous online. People were provided a website link, and once they were provided with all the information, benefit and harm, and some discussion, we went to online voting. If it was greater than 80% consensus, the recommendation was considered to be passed. If it was less than 80%, then people were able to provide and ask questions or clarifications, and we could make any changes if necessary, and voting was repeated. So in this case, we see that 100% consensus that parent and caregivers should be considered essential caregivers for their infant in the NICU. Next slide, Fabiana. So the next one was parent and caregivers should have unrestricted access to provide skin-to-skin contact for their infant in the NICU within the pandemic and or current any upcoming or in pandemic planning. And this was also 100% unanimous as a strong recommendation. And next slide. Just to let you know that we defined unrestricted is that no restrictions on having 2 parent or caregivers in the NICU at the same time, and that was no restrictions 24/7, and that they could move between home and hospital, and symptomatic status or COVID-19 positivity status would require, of course, PPE, that is effective, and any of the other elements that someone within a hospital setting would require if indeed they were positive. Next slide. Our next strong recommendation was parent and caregivers should have unrestricted access to breastfeed, to receive breastfeeding supports, including early hand expression, pumping and pumps, encouragement, lactation support for their infant while they're in the NICU, and again, 100% consensus on this recommendation. Next, our next strong recommendation is that NICU parent partners or stakeholders should be included in co-designing or decision-making for parent-related NICU policies with respect to infection control, response planning, to be ensured that they were included rather than excluded from these decision-making. And again, this was 100%. The next strong recommendation was that parent and caregivers should have uninterrupted access to attend medical rounds where their infant is admitted to the NICU. And this would be, when we use the term uninterrupted, we mean in the same way that they would have been offered previously. So in whatever means that families, that there should be no interruption in families being able to attend rounds, even in a pandemic setting. Next slide. And that parent and caregivers should have uninterrupted access to mental health and psychosocial support services while their infant is admitted. And again, this was 100% consensus because the evidence really showed us that families of infants requiring neonatal intensive care already have higher risks for mental health and need for psychosocial support. And this was extremely heightened during a pandemic. Next slide. So we also then had conditional recommendations. And so just to let you know, for the purpose of including these and implementing these recommendations within your NICU, the element would be that these are all recommended, that they should be instituted in our current evidence, that we know that the benefit outweighs harm. However, the reason that it's conditional is that there are some uncertainty around some of the existing evidence. So there may potentially be some possibility that these recommendations could change based on new evidence or based on a different type of pandemic. Next slide. And so these would be parent or caregivers should have unrestricted access to provide hands-on care tasks for their infants in the NICU, again with 100% consensus. And we describe, next slide, the hands-on care tasks to include any direct bedside care such as diapering, bathing, taking temperatures, comforting, feeding, and providing nutrition. Next slide. The next conditional recommendation was that parent conditioners caregivers should have unrestricted access to provide healing touch for their infant in the NICU. Again, 100% consensus from our large group. And next slide, Fabiana. Healing touch was defined by parents present, is the idea that providing healing touch was defined from using a parent's perspective, and that it's the idea that providing touch for the infant can be healing for both the parent and the baby. And this includes things like facilitated tucking, massage, and other physical contacts outside of skin to skin, which it has its own body of evidence. So it was defined in a previous recommendation. Next slide. The parent or caregiver should have unrestricted in-person access to attend medical rounds while their infant is admitted to the NICU, and that virtual care services could be preferred by the family and provided, but that all families should have unrestricted in-person access should they choose. So again, 100% consensus on this. Next slide. Parent and caregivers should have unrestricted access to food and allocated spaces to eat and drink while their infant is admitted to the NICU. Again, 100% consensus on this conditional recommendation. Next slide. And that two parents should have uninterrupted access to be present while their infant is admitted to the NICU at any time together. Again, this was passed as a conditional recommendation, just slightly 95% consensus within our team. But still, if you remember, any item that had greater than 80% voting in was considered passed and would be considered recommendations. Next slide. That a parent or caregiver should have unrestricted access to use communication devices, their own or the hospital devices, for remote connectiveness and support while they were in the NICU with their infant. And there was 89% agreement on this. And just of note, we did find in our national survey, surprisingly, that there was really quite extremes across our national NICUs, with some NICUs providing devices, supporting devices, and other units restricting all devices. So this was certainly something that we felt very strongly that should be recommended. And lastly, our final recommendation was that parents or caregivers should have unrestricted in-person access to mental health and psychosocial support services while their infant is admitted, and that virtual care services may be preferred, again, based on parent, but that if not parent preference, that they should be able to have them in person. And again, 84% consensus and part of our recommendations. So next slide. And just to say that mental health and psychosocial support services were defined as NICU-affiliated services. So defined as being officially attached or connected to the NICU, paid or unpaid. It could be provided by a parent partner or peer support person, or it could be from a professional social worker, psychologist, or advanced practice nurse, but they would be all NICU-affiliated. Next slide. So that's a lot of discussion, and it seems so funny because it actually was easier to say it than to actually find consensus. I think later on we'll talk, Fabiana and Jenna can say we had a broad cross-sectorial group, very diverse backgrounds, and lots of discussion to come up with consensus for those recommendations. But now that we really hope that we'll be able to have broad dissemination, active advocacy from families, healthcare providers, all of our societies and partners, members of our teams, and we really hope that we can have this become part of accreditation criteria for our Canadian neonatal networks and neonatal units. So we do have, and we will have downloadable on our the Canadian Premature Baby Foundation Network to help with this dissemination. Next slide, Fabiana. We have infographics that tell you about sort of what sparked our project, how we got there, sort of the evidence and the rigor of the science in order to come up with these consensus and what we found. And these will be able to be downloadable and used and shared. And we'll have this form as well as the next slide is just a slightly different infographic, but really with much of the same content. So we look forward to working with all of our partners, parents, healthcare providers, leaders, and we really just want to thank again the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for funding this work, for all of our community partners, all of our families and care providers who participate in the surveys, our consensus group who had the patience to sit through many, many meetings. And I think I'll stop there and be happy to, Fabi and I will take any questions that you might have.
Thank you both for that presentation. And I know it was a lot of information compiled, and knowing as much as I do about how much work went into coming up with those, you did a fantastic job of breaking it down in a way that hopefully people will be able to understand. Like you said, those downloadable infographics, I think, will really help people have a sense of what these recommendations are and how they play together to really hopefully help parents in the future. I'm wondering maybe if we could talk a little bit about one of the things as a parent especially that kind of stood out to me through our discussions when we were working on this, but also listening to the presentation again, was the importance of word choice and how important the words that you chose to use are. And I'm wondering if we could just, I don't know, maybe Marsha, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Jenna. So it was really interesting because I don't think I've always been aware of that, but I don't think I even had any, could possibly fathom just how important it was within this large group, and how one word could stop people in their tracks and sort of be like, no, we could not agree to that. But just talking about what the meanings of the words and also the importance of clear definitions that would accompany these. And so it will be really important that as people, and we roll these out, that we include those definitions and the subtleties of words. And I think we recognize that all the time when we talk about families. Sometimes I talk about the subtleties of words and that, never, not visitors, never allow. There's lots of words that we use that we are learning every day, but in the form of the national consensus guidelines was just even in the definitions and how we described each of the recommendations, for sure. Mm-hmm. What would you think, Fabiana? A few headbanging days?
Well, we are scratching our heads in many of those meetings because as you mentioned, the definitions, there was a lot of discussion on the definitions, but for me personally, after a year work with the same group, to see the changes of them in the beginning referring to parents as visitors and visiting policies, to the end of the work, they really understood that parents are not visitors. For me, it was a big gain right there, but it really showed us how much work we still have to do, because we work with leaders in their fields. So now, we have to work with everyone in the community to change it. It's a cultural shift, how they see the parents and how the hospitals see the parents. And sometimes the NICU teams, they understand that, but not the hospital, the policymakers. And I think with this recommendation, you have to reach policymakers and make sure the parent partners are involved in the policy making process. moving forward. Otherwise, the fear is if there is another pandemic, hopefully not, things are going to go back to square one. Mm-hmm. Because we were not able to change culture in hospitals. And I think this is a lot of work to be done from now on. I think that we thought we had done a lot of work, which we did, but I think the real work starts now on change and shifting the way people perceive parents in the hospitals. Mm-hmm. Because you're not only talking about pediatric hospitals. I think pediatric hospitals really see parents as partners, caregivers, essential caregivers. I feel from our experience at the CPDF with parents, what they told us, a lot of hospitals, or adult hospitals, that they have labor and delivery, they have a smaller NICU or even a bigger NICU, but in an adult setting, the views of the parents is different. And I think there's a lot of work to be done, especially in those settings.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point, and I wonder, what impact, maybe Marsha, you can speak to this, it might have going forward, that parents can advocate more now for themselves because of foundations like this and work like this, and it being accessible. It's not something that's just in the hands of administrators, and how can you see parents continuing to play a role to advocate for this?
Well, I think there's two really important elements. Is that one, just to go back to the creation of the guide, the recommendations, having a parent voice, parents who could really speak to and ground some of the healthcare providers who we know are only making decisions to what they think are the best. And sometimes they're not always well informed. And so having that parent voice, I think, really helps set the stage for openness and trying to listen, to be more open to what the actual benefits are versus being overwhelmed with possible harm. And without the parent voice, I think at our consensus group meetings, it would have been even more challenging to have consensus across such a broad group of administrators, leaders, public health, infectious disease, neonatal clinicians. So that is so important. So I would say that when families, and certainly one of our recommendations talked about the fact that nothing about us should be without us, and that families really do need to be at those tables. And so being available, it's a tremendous amount of work. I mean, Fabiana, you and Jenna know, and how grateful we are to have families participate. So that's the number one. And then the other thing is, never underestimate, as clinicians, we can go to legislation and politicians and different things, but nothing is the same as a family voice or family story. And so, again, I think together, one of the strengths, I believe, of this group was, again, we were able to bring the lived experience and with the evidence. And we did, we looked at every piece of every evidence, right down to the statistical manner of benefit and harm. And when you do that, when the evidence is clear, everybody's going to have least amount of harm. But when there's also obvious benefit, then you need to find the best recommendation. And I think that's what we were able to do. And my hope is that these recommendations will not only impact change now, because we do need to put some of the things in place, because if we do have a future pandemic, we can't start at that time. We need to do it now. But also that we will have materials so that if indeed something does happen, we'll have somewhere to go that is evidence. And I believe that regardless of who's making the decisions, when you have scientific evidence and lived experience of benefit and harm, people are more likely to listen and actually make the changes that's best for everybody.
Yeah, but I also think right now, because now people think, everything is, the pandemic is over, everything is back to normal. It's not back to normal.
No.
And as you say, like COVID-19 recovery phase right now, to try to restore family-centered care, family-integrated care. And I think that these recommendations should be implemented now, discussed now, as Marsha said, for the present moment, because not every hospital went back to where it was before. We know that as a fact from our families, where they share with us that there's still restrictions happening. Parent partners are still not back into the hospitals providing peer support or in advisory committees inside the hospital. So it's still a lot of work to do now.
A lot of work, yes. I think we've lost almost a decade of our family integrated care in some of our facilities, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. So I really hope that people wouldn't dismiss this as saying, oh yeah, well, okay, it was fine, we could have used it 2 years ago, but it's not really important now. But really to look at these recommendations and instituting many of them, I think will actually help repair and bring back the important focus of family integrated care across our neonatal intensive care units.
Definitely. This is a bit of a different model of research than I think a lot of people are familiar with. And I'm wondering if you wanted to speak just a little bit more to this type of consensus gathering and how you see that moving forward.
That's a great question, Jenna. So it's a fairly new framework. But what I think it does is it allows you to take all the evidence, and when that evidence is clear, it's easy to make a decision. But when it's not so clear, then it's important to really take into people's values and preferences. Now, I will also say that even when the evidence is clear, what I think the strengths of this type of framework development is if you have the right people. So for example, if this is about the families and babies, and the families really, the evidence points people in a certain area, but those areas aren't actually the most important to the families, then that becomes very clear, because many times clinicians will follow the evidence, and so we should. Don't get me wrong, I'm a scientist, clear and true, but sometimes we can be misguided without asking the people that it most impacts when you make recommendations where we should weight or put the most important elements to guide that recommendations. And I think that's what this type of framework does. I hope it becomes more and more common. It is a lot of work. But I think in the end, you get better recommendations.
Fabiana, I wonder if you want to just speak from kind of the parent perspective on that for anyone who might find themselves in the position to be asked to take part in a study like this in the future. What do parents need to know about it?
Well, actually, we are developing a framework for parents to engage in research. So Marsha is leading that work at CPBF. Sometimes for parents to collaborate in research is very intimidating, right? Because you come to a table with experts and we question ourselves, what expertise am I bringing? I only have the lived experience, but the only lived experience is a very important experience, and it's a very important point that we're bringing to this table. And parents, when I started getting engaged in research 10 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing there. I was just quiet, observing, not sure what my place was. But then I realized over the years, work with incredible scientists in Canada and worldwide, how important my voice was. And I think all the parents who want to engage in research, we just get started. get started with something that you're passionate about, or a diagnosis that the child has, or something that is relatable to you, that is, okay, I do have that experience, and you can share with the scientists at the table. And it's amazing how every table that I ever sat, I was always very welcome. Sometimes it's very intimidating, not going to lie about that, but I always feel welcome. And I think if you find a person like Marsha, that I've been very fortunate to work with Marsha, or some other scientists across Canada, they are so welcoming, and they take the time to teach you, to introduce you to the project, to translate the project in a language that we are going to understand. I think is the most valuable thing that I ever done to my life, to be engaged in research, and in a way collaborating to the field, to the solution, being part of the solution. I think that's what research means to me. I know my son came this far in life because of research, because of parents that said yes to research before. And I think now for me, it's a payback time that I also collaborate with researchers. And here at CPBF, we're trying our best to educate parents on how to engage with research so we can all move forward together. Because Marsha said, and this is a quote from the disability world, nothing about us without us. And I think for now, we bring parents, but we also bring adults who are born preterm, because they are very important at this table, even more important than the parents, because that's, we talk about their lives. We talk about our parent experience in the NICU. We talk about the life of these preemie babies who become adults. So they also need to have a voice at those tables. And for us, it's a very rewarding piece of what we do at CPBF, to be at these tables, to bring the parents, to train the parents, to collaborate with them, to be involved in many different projects. But this project for us was, present study was one of the most important projects CPBF has been involved, for many reasons. One, because I mentioned before, is the first one that we co-led with a researcher. And we're also grateful for Marsha forever for having me as a co-leading this project. But it also is a project that we know that will be an immediate effect on families, because we understood from the get-go of the pandemic the harm that just the separation, the restrictions are causing on families. And 3 years later, we see the families with mental health issues and challenges because of those restrictions. So I think this is the most meaningful, not I think, I know this is the most meaningful work we've done over the last 5 years at CPBF. So Marsha, thank you for that. So now we're gonna keep going to change the policies.
Yes, thank you, Fabiana, and thank you, Jenna, because, and I'm so grateful, and it's just been an amazing opportunity, and I would recommend all researchers to find a co-parent to lead their research studies. And I would just preface that it doesn't always have to be such a large study either, that parents can be involved. And I recognize that families have lots and lots going on in their lives. But even, small, there's different things. And that's what Fabi and I have talked about, is to try to help piece that out about what types of ways that families can be involved that would fit into their lives, that they would still be able to give back, to help inform, to be part, but that works really well within their life right now. And so we'll be excited to be sharing some of that material with the Canadian Premature Baby Foundation through their website.
That's fantastic. I feel like that's a good spot for us to stop for now, because I know the three of us could talk for a very long time about this. But for today's discussion, I think we'll wrap it up there. And thank you both for taking the time not only to do all this work, but to share it with us today.
Thank you so much, Jenna and Fabiana, and grateful to be here.
Thank you everyone who joined us today, who've been watching online. Those of you who are watching this on the replay, thank you for coming and taking the time. And thank you, of course, to our sponsors for this discussion as well, to AstraZeneca for their ongoing support of our educational programs at CPBF, and to our partners at the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses and FICARE. Preemie Chats will be back again next week at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you can join then for the discussion, and until then, take care.